The small diner on Highway 9 wasn't much to look at. Its neon sign flickered in the darkness, casting red and blue shadows across the empty parking lot. Inside, the smell of coffee and grilled cheese filled the air. It was nearly midnight, and the place was almost empty except for a tired waitress wiping down tables and an old cook in the back. Sarah Mitchell sat alone in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee. She wore a simple gray hoodie and jeans, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. To anyone watching, she looked like just another traveler passing through town. Nothing about her appearance suggested what she really was or what she had been through. She had been driving for 6 hours straight, coming back from her brother's wedding in Colorado. The ceremony had been beautiful, filled with laughter and dancing. For 2 days she had smiled and celebrated, playing the role of the proud sister. Nobody there knew about her real life. Nobody knew about the missions, the training, or the things she had seen in dark corners of the world. Sarah took a sip of her coffee and glanced at her phone. Another hour of driving and she would be home. She could already imagine her soft bed and the silence of her apartment. Peace and quiet. That was all she wanted right now. The bell above the door chimed as 3 men walked in. They were loud from the moment they entered, their voices cutting through the quiet atmosphere of the diner. The waitress looked up nervously as they took a booth near the center of the room. Sarah barely glanced at them, keeping her eyes on her phone. The men were in their late 20s or early 30s, dressed in dirty work clothes and smelling of alcohol. The tallest one, with a thick beard and a baseball cap, seemed to be the leader of the group. His 2 friends followed his lead, laughing too loudly at his jokes and banging their fists on the table. The waitress, a woman in her 50s named Betty, approached their table with menus. Her hands shook slightly as she handed them over. She had worked at this diner for 15 years and had seen plenty of difficult customers. These men made her nervous in a way that went beyond simple rudeness. The bearded man grabbed the menu without looking at Betty. His eyes were already scanning the diner, landing on Sarah in the corner. He elbowed one of his friends and nodded in her direction. All 3 men turned to stare. Sarah felt their eyes on her but didn't react. She had dealt with men like this before. The best strategy was always to ignore them completely. She took another sip of coffee and scrolled through her phone, pretending they didn't exist. Betty took their order and hurried back to the kitchen, relieved to get away from their table. The cook, an elderly man named Frank, saw the worry on her face and asked if everything was okay. Betty nodded but kept glancing through the order window at the 3 men. The bearded man stood up from his booth. His friends laughed and one of them said something Sarah couldn't hear. She watched from the corner of her eye as he walked toward the restroom, passing close to her table. As he went by, he deliberately bumped against her booth, making her coffee cup rattle. Sarah said nothing. She simply steadied her cup and continued looking at her phone. The man paused, clearly expecting some kind of reaction. When he got none, he sneered and continued to the restroom. His 2 friends whispered to each other, occasionally looking in Sarah's direction. One of them, a shorter man with greasy blonde hair, seemed particularly interested. He kept turning around in his seat to stare at her. When the bearded man returned from the restroom, he didn't go back to his table. Instead, he walked directly to Sarah's booth and stood there, looking down at her. Sarah could smell the alcohol on his breath from 3 feet away. She slowly raised her eyes to meet his, her face completely neutral. No fear, no anger, nothing. Just a calm, steady gaze that had stared down much more dangerous men in much more dangerous places. The man smiled, showing yellow teeth. He thought her silence meant weakness. He thought her calm demeanor meant she was afraid to speak up. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Betty watched from behind the counter, her hand moving toward the phone. Frank came out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. Both of them had seen situations like this escalate before. The bearded man slid into the booth across from Sarah without invitation. His 2 friends laughed and one of them whistled. Sarah set down her phone and folded her hands on the table, still saying nothing. He leaned forward, invading her space. His voice was low and threatening, meant to intimidate. He asked where she was headed, whether she was alone, and made several inappropriate comments about her appearance. Each question was more invasive than the last. Sarah remained perfectly still. Her breathing stayed even and controlled. Years of training had taught her to manage her body's stress response. Her heart rate stayed steady even as adrenaline began flowing through her system. She was assessing the situation, calculating distances, identifying potential weapons within reach. The man grew frustrated by her lack of response. He reached across the table and grabbed her wrist. His grip was meant to hurt, to force a reaction. Sarah looked down at his hand on her wrist, then back up at his face. Still, she said nothing. His two friends stood up from their booth and moved closer. They were emboldened by their leader's actions and by Sarah's apparent passivity. The shorter blonde man leaned against her booth, blocking her exit. The third man, who had been quiet until now, stood behind the bearded leader. Betty finally picked up the phone to call the police. Frank moved from behind the counter, but he was an old man. And these were three younger, stronger men. He didn't know what he could do, but he had to try something. Sarah finally spoke. Her voice was calm and quiet, but there was steel underneath it. She told the man to let go of her wrist. She didn't threaten. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stated a fact as if commenting on the weather. The bearded man laughed. His friends joined in. They thought this was funny. They thought she was trying to sound tough to cover her fear. The man squeezed her wrist harder and leaned even closer across the table. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was assuming that silence meant surrender. His third and final mistake was not recognizing the look in Sarah Mitchell's eyes, the one that came from 6 years as a Navy SEAL, from missions in 3 different war zones, and from training that had pushed her beyond limits most people couldn't imagine. What happened next would take exactly 15 seconds. 15 seconds that these 3 men would never forget for the rest of their lives. Sarah's movement was so fast that the bearded man didn't even process what was happening until it was over. In one fluid motion, she twisted her wrist in a specific way that broke his grip, then grabbed his hand with both of hers. She stood up from the booth while simultaneously pulling his arm forward and down, using his own momentum and body weight against him. The man's face slammed into the table with a loud crack. His nose broke instantly, blood spraying across the laminate surface. Before his 2 friends could even react, Sarah had twisted his arm behind his back in a position that made any movement agonizingly painful. She pushed him down onto the bench seat of the booth, keeping perfect control of his arm. The whole sequence took less than 3 seconds. The shorter blonde man was the first to recover from his shock. He lunged at Sarah from the side, reaching for her shoulders. She saw him coming from her peripheral vision. Without releasing her grip on the bearded man's arm, she pivoted her body and drove her elbow into the blonde man's solar plexus. The air rushed out of his lungs in a whoosh. He stumbled backward, gasping, his face turning red as he struggled to breathe. His hands clutched at his chest as he dropped to his knees on the diner floor. 5 seconds had passed. The third man, who had been standing behind his friend, finally realized he needed to act. He was bigger than the other 2, probably weighing close to 250 pounds. He reached for Sarah with both hands, intending to grab her in a bear hug from behind. Sarah released the bearded man's arm and spun around. As the big man's arms began to close around her, she dropped her weight and slipped under his grasp. Then she drove the heel of her palm upward into his chin. His head snapped back and his eyes went unfocused. While he was stunned, Sarah grabbed his shirt and used a basic judo throw to send him crashing to the floor. The big man hit the ground so hard that dishes rattled in the kitchen. He lay there, dazed and confused, trying to figure out how he had ended up on his back. 8 seconds total. The bearded man, blood still pouring from his broken nose, tried to get up from the booth. Sarah turned back to him and placed one hand on his shoulder. She applied pressure to a specific point that sent pain shooting through his entire arm. He froze, his eyes watering from the combination of his broken nose and the pressure point she had found. She leaned down and spoke quietly, her voice still calm. She told him that if he moved, she would dislocate his shoulder. She wasn't threatening. She was simply stating a fact. He believed her completely. 10 seconds. The shorter blonde man was still on his knees, finally starting to catch his breath. He looked up at Sarah with genuine fear in his eyes. Whatever confidence and bravado he had walked in with was completely gone. He raised his hands in surrender, wanting no part of whatever else might happen. 12 seconds. The big man on the floor groaned and rolled onto his side. He made no attempt to get up. He had no desire to continue this fight. He just wanted the pain to stop and the room to stop spinning. 15 seconds had passed since the bearded man had grabbed Sarah's wrist. 3 men who had walked into the diner thinking they were tough now lay defeated, broken, and terrified. Betty stood behind the counter with the phone still in her hand, her mouth hanging open. She had been about to dial the police, but events had unfolded so quickly that her finger had frozen over the keypad. Frank stood nearby, equally stunned. He had been ready to try to help, but there had been no need. Sarah released the bearded man's shoulder and stepped back. She was breathing normally, as if she had just taken a casual walk rather than neutralized 3 attackers in under 20 seconds. There wasn't a scratch on her, and her gray hoodie wasn't even wrinkled. She looked at Betty and gave her a small nod. The waitress finally remembered to breathe and nodded back, then completed her call to the police. Her voice shook as she reported the incident, though she struggled to explain exactly what had happened. Sarah calmly walked back to her booth and sat down. Her coffee was cold now, and there was blood splattered on the table where the bearded man's face had hit. She pushed the cup away and pulled out some cash from her pocket, leaving it on the table to pay for her coffee and probably cover the cleanup. The bearded man was slumped in the opposite booth, holding his bleeding nose with both hands. Blood dripped through his fingers onto his shirt. His eyes were glazed with pain and shock. He kept looking at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time, trying to understand how this quiet woman in a hoodie had destroyed him so easily. The blonde man had crawled to a nearby booth and pulled himself onto the seat. He sat there holding his stomach, still struggling to breathe normally. Every few seconds he would glance at Sarah, then quickly look away, unable to meet her eyes. The big man had managed to sit up, but remained on the floor, leaning against the side of a booth. One hand touched the back of his head where it had hit the floor. He looked confused more than anything else, as if he had been transported to this position by magic and couldn't quite figure out how. Frank approached Sarah's table carefully, as if afraid he might startle her. He set down a fresh cup of coffee, this one on the house. His old hands were steady as he poured, though his eyes showed his amazement at what he had witnessed. Sarah thanked him quietly. Frank nodded and returned to the kitchen, shaking his head in disbelief. In all his years working at the diner, he had never seen anything like that. The minutes passed in tense silence. None of the 3 men moved or spoke. They had learned their lesson thoroughly and completely. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional groan of pain from the injured men, and the drip of blood hitting the floor. Betty kept glancing between Sarah and the 3 men, still processing what she had witnessed. This small woman, who couldn't weigh more than 140 pounds, had taken down 3 larger men as easily as if they were children. Betty had seen bar fights before, had seen angry men throw punches and wrestle on the floor. This had been nothing like that. This had been surgical, precise, and completely one-sided. Sarah sipped her fresh coffee and checked her phone. She responded to a text from her brother, thanking her again for coming to the wedding. She asked if he and his new wife had enjoyed their first day of married life. Normal conversation. Casual small talk. As if the last 15 minutes hadn't happened at all. The bearded man finally found his voice. It came out nasal and thick because of his broken nose. He asked Sarah who she was, what she was. The question was filled with pain and genuine confusion. Sarah looked up from her phone. She met his eyes for a long moment, then simply returned to her screen without answering. She didn't owe him an explanation. She didn't owe him anything. In the distance, the sound of police sirens began to grow louder. Betty went to the door and looked out, watching for the patrol cars. Frank came back out from the kitchen with a first aid kit, though he wasn't sure if he should offer it to the injured men or not. The bearded man tried again. He apologized, his words tumbling over each other. He said they were just messing around, that they didn't mean any harm, that things got out of hand. His voice was desperate, pleading. He seemed to understand that he had made a terrible mistake, though he still didn't fully grasp what kind of person he had attacked. Sarah finished her text and set her phone down. She looked at each of the 3 men in turn, her gaze moving from one to the next. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear enough for all of them to hear. She told them they were lucky. She told them that in her world, men who assaulted women didn't usually walk away. She let that statement hang in the air, letting them imagine what she meant. The big man on the floor went pale. The blond man looked like he might be sick. The bearded man just stared at her, blood still dripping from his nose, understanding finally dawning in his eyes. 2 police cars pulled into the parking lot, their lights painting the diner windows red and blue. 2 officers entered the diner with their hands resting on their service weapons, not knowing what kind of situation they were walking into. The younger officer, a man in his late 20s with sharp eyes, scanned the scene immediately. His partner, a woman with gray streaks in her dark hair and 20 years of experience, took in the blood, the injured men, and the calm woman sitting alone in the corner booth. Betty rushed to meet them, her words coming out in a jumbled rush. She tried to explain what had happened but kept backing up to add details she had forgotten. The younger officer, whose name tag read Martinez, listened patiently while his partner, Officer Chen, approached the 3 injured men to assess their condition. Officer Chen had seen plenty of bar fights and domestic disturbances in her career. She knew what assault victims usually looked like, and she knew what perpetrators looked like after a fight. These 3 men had the injuries of people who had been in a serious confrontation, but something about the scene didn't add up. The bearded man's nose was clearly broken, already swelling and turning purple. The blond man still held his stomach, his breathing labored. The big man had a growing lump on the back of his head and seemed disoriented. Yet the woman sitting calmly in the corner booth didn't have a single mark on her. Officer Martinez approached Sarah's table while his partner called for an ambulance. He introduced himself politely and asked if she was all right. Sarah nodded and took another sip of her coffee. Her hands were completely steady, no shaking, no signs of adrenaline crash. Martinez asked what had happened. Sarah's explanation was brief and factual. She stated that she had been sitting alone when the 3 men approached her. One of them grabbed her wrist. She defended herself. That was all. Martinez looked from Sarah to the 3 injured men, then back to Sarah. He had been a police officer for 5 years and had responded to dozens of assault calls. Never had he seen a situation where one person, especially a woman of Sarah's size, had so thoroughly defended themselves against 3 attackers. He asked if she had any training. Sarah hesitated for just a moment. She preferred not to discuss her background, especially not with strangers. But she understood that the police needed information to file their report. She told Officer Martinez that she had military training. Martinez nodded slowly, pieces starting to fall into place. He asked which branch of the military. Sarah said Navy. He asked if she was still active duty. She explained that she had been honorably discharged 6 months ago and was now working as a security consultant. Officer. Chen finished her preliminary examination of the 3 men and joined her partner at Sarah's table. She had overheard the last part of the conversation. Chen asked Sarah directly if she had been a Navy SEAL. There was respect in her voice and something else. Recognition, perhaps. Chen's own son had tried out for the SEALs program and failed during Hell Week. Sarah confirmed it with a simple nod. She didn't elaborate on her service, didn't mention the missions or the medals or the years of brutal training that had shaped her into a weapon. She just acknowledged the fact and waited for the next question. The 2 officers exchanged a look. This changed everything. They had walked in, expecting to find either a victim who had somehow gotten lucky or a situation much more complicated than it appeared. Instead, they had found a highly trained special operations veteran who had simply defended herself against 3 drunk idiots who had no idea what they were getting into. Officer Chen asked Sarah to walk her through the incident step by step. Sarah complied, her narrative precise and detailed. She explained exactly how the bearded man had grabbed her wrist, how she had broken his grip and controlled his arm, how the second man had attacked from the side, and she had defended herself with a strike to his solar plexus, and how the third man had attempted to grab her from behind before she put him on the ground. Chen took notes, occasionally asking for clarification. Martinez went to speak with the 3 men, taking their statements separately. The bearded man's story matched Sarah's account, though he added details about the pain and humiliation. He admitted that he had grabbed her first. He admitted that they had been drinking. He admitted that they had approached her uninvited and refused to leave when she remained silent. The blond man was even more forthcoming. He seemed eager to take responsibility, perhaps hoping that cooperation would reduce his consequences. He confirmed that they had been harassing Sarah, that she had done nothing to provoke them, and that she had only acted after physical contact was initiated. The big man said very little. He was still dazed from hitting his head and could barely remember the details. He confirmed that they had approached the woman and that things had escalated quickly. He couldn't explain exactly how he had ended up on the floor. An ambulance arrived and paramedics entered the diner. They attended to the 3 men, cleaning the bearded man's broken nose, checking the blond man's ribs, and examining the big man's head injury for signs of concussion. All three would need to go to the hospital for proper treatment. Frank brought Sarah a piece of pie, refusing to accept payment. He told her it was the least he could do. Betty came over to refill her coffee for the third time, her hands finally steady. She thanked Sarah quietly, explaining that she had been afraid of what those men might have done if Sarah hadn't been able to defend herself. Betty had daughters of her own and knew how situations like this could end tragically. Officer Chen returned to Sarah's table and sat down across from her. She explained that based on all the statements and witness testimony, it was clear that Sarah had acted in self-defense. The three men would be charged with assault, disorderly conduct, and public intoxication. Sarah would need to file a formal statement, but Chen didn't anticipate any charges being brought against her. Sarah thanked the officer and said she understood the process. She had been through legal proceedings before, though usually as a witness rather than a victim. She provided her contact information and agreed to come to the station the next day to sign her official statement. The paramedics loaded the three men into the ambulance. The bearded man looked back at Sarah one more time as they wheeled him out. His eyes held no more anger or lust, only shame and fear. He would have plenty of time to think about this night, about the moment he decided to grab a stranger's wrist, about the 15 seconds that followed. Officer Martinez approached Sarah before leaving. He told her that his younger brother had tried to become a SEAL and had washed out during Bud's training. Martinez said his brother had described it as the hardest thing he had ever attempted, and he had only made it through 2 weeks. Martinez looked at Sarah with newfound respect, understanding now what kind of training and toughness her service represented. Sarah simply thanked him for his professionalism. She didn't need recognition or praise. She had done her job tonight the same way she had done her job for 6 years in the Navy. She had assessed a threat, neutralized it efficiently, and ensured the safety of everyone involved, including her attackers. She had used the minimum force necessary to control the situation. The officers left, promising to send Sarah a copy of the report. Betty and Frank began cleaning up the blood and straightening the furniture that had been disturbed. The diner slowly returned to normal, though the energy in the room had permanently changed. Sarah sat alone in her booth, finishing the pie Frank had brought her. It was good pie, homemade apple with a perfect crust. She savored each bite, grateful for the kindness of these two strangers who had witnessed her defending herself. Betty approached the table one more time before Sarah left. The older woman had tears in her eyes. She told Sarah that her granddaughter was in college now, living alone in a big city. Betty worried about her constantly, worried about men like those three who thought they could take what they wanted. Seeing Sarah defend herself so effectively had given Betty a strange kind of hope. Sarah assured Betty that most men weren't like those three. She encouraged Betty to suggest that her granddaughter take self-defense classes, not because the world was full of predators, but because confidence and training could prevent situations from escalating. Knowledge was power, and the ability to defend yourself changed how you carried yourself in the world. Betty squeezed Sarah's hand and thanked her again. She insisted that Sarah take the rest of the pie to go, wrapping it carefully in aluminum foil. Frank came out from the kitchen with a container of fresh coffee for Sarah's drive. Sarah accepted both gifts graciously. She left a generous tip on the table, far more than the coffee and pie were worth. As she walked toward the door, Betty called out to her, asking if she was going to be okay. Sarah turned back and smiled. It was the first real smile she had shown all night. She told Betty that she would be just fine. She had dealt with much worse than 3 drunk men in a diner. Sarah pulled into her apartment complex at 2 a.m. The building was quiet, most windows dark except for a few night owls still awake. She grabbed her overnight bag from the trunk along with the pie and coffee Betty and Frank had given her. Her muscles felt loose and relaxed despite the confrontation hours earlier. The physical activity had actually helped work out the stiffness from 6 hours of driving. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, a modest 1-bedroom place that she had rented after leaving the Navy. The walls were mostly bare except for a few photos of her family and some landscape pictures she had taken during her travels. There were no military photos, no pictures of her in uniform, no plaques or medals on display. That part of her life was private, stored in a box in her closet. She set the pie on the kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of water. The adrenaline had long since faded from her system, replaced by a familiar calm that came from years of training and experience. She thought about the three men in the diner, probably sitting in an emergency room right now getting their injuries treated. Part of her felt sorry for them. They had made a stupid decision fueled by alcohol and ego, and now they would face legal consequences on top of their physical injuries. But another part of her felt no sympathy at all. She had seen too much in her military career, had worked missions rescuing victims of human trafficking, had witnessed the aftermath of violence against innocent people. Those three men had chosen to harass and physically assault someone they perceived as weak. They had learned a hard lesson tonight, but at least they had lived to learn it. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her former commanding officer, Commander Patricia Hayes. The message was brief, asking if Sarah was still available for a consulting job next week. Hayes had been Sarah's mentor throughout her SEAL career and had been instrumental in helping Sarah transition to civilian life after her discharge. Sarah texted back confirming her availability. The consulting work was interesting and paid well. She helped train security personnel for private companies, taught self-defense courses, and occasionally advised on security protocols for high-risk situations. It wasn't the same as being operational, but it kept her skills sharp and gave her purpose. She took a quick shower and changed into comfortable clothes. As she brushed her teeth, she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. There were no visible marks from the confrontation, no bruises or cuts. The three men had never landed a single blow. She thought about how different things might have been if she hadn't had her training, if she had been an ordinary person unable to defend herself. Sleep came easily, despite the evening's events. Sarah had learned long ago to compartmentalize, to process experiences and then let them go. Dwelling on what had happened served no purpose. She had faced the situation, handled it appropriately, and moved on. The next morning, Sarah woke at 6 o'clock out of habit. Years of military discipline had programmed her body to rise early, regardless of when she went to bed. She made coffee and ate a slice of the apple pie for breakfast while checking her emails. There was a message from Officer Chen with a time for Sarah to come to the police station to sign her statement. At 10 o'clock, Sarah arrived at the police station. Officer Chen met her in the lobby and led her to a small interview room. The formal statement process was straightforward. Sarah read through the typed report, confirmed its accuracy, and signed where indicated. Chen explained that the three men had been released from the hospital overnight with orders to appear in court in 3 weeks. Chen asked Sarah if she planned to press charges. Sarah said she would testify if needed, but didn't have any desire for revenge or punishment beyond what the legal system deemed appropriate. She just wanted the matter handled and closed so she could move on with her life. As Sarah was preparing to leave, Chen asked if she would be willing to speak to a women's self-defense class that Chen volunteered with on weekends. The officer explained that she taught basic safety and defense techniques to women in the community, and having someone with Sarah's background and experience speak to the class would be incredibly valuable. Sarah hesitated. She generally avoided public speaking about her military service, preferring to keep that part of her life private. But something about Chen's request resonated with her. She thought about Betty's granddaughter in college, about all the women who lived with fear of being attacked, about how her training could potentially help others avoid becoming victims. She agreed to speak to the class, and they scheduled it for the following Saturday. Chen thanked her warmly and walked her out of the station. As Sarah drove home, she thought about what she might say to a group of women learning to defend themselves. Her training had been intense and specialized, far beyond what civilians would ever need. But the principles were the same: awareness, confidence, and the willingness to act when necessary. The week passed quietly. Sarah worked on preparing materials for her consulting job with Commander Hayes, went to the gym daily to maintain her fitness, and spent time planning what she would say to Chen's self-defense class. She also received a call from a local news reporter who had heard about the diner incident and wanted to interview her. Sarah politely declined. She had no interest in publicity or attention. On Wednesday, she received a letter in the mail from the bearded man. His name was Michael Carson, and he had somehow obtained her address, probably through the police report. The letter was handwritten, the script shaky and unsure. Carson apologized profusely for his actions that night. He explained that he had been going through a difficult time, had been drinking too much, and had made terrible decisions. He didn't offer excuses, just acknowledged his wrongdoing and expressed genuine remorse. The letter went on to explain that he had children of his own, 2 daughters aged 10 and 12. Lying in the hospital bed with a broken nose, he had thought about what would happen if someone treated his daughters the way he had treated Sarah. The realization had devastated him. He was seeking counseling for his alcohol abuse and anger issues. He asked for nothing from Sarah, not forgiveness or mercy. He simply wanted her to know that her actions that night had potentially saved him from becoming an even worse person. Sarah read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. She appreciated the apology and hoped Carson followed through with his stated intentions to change. But she had seen too many people make promises they didn't keep. Time would tell whether his remorse was genuine or just fear of legal consequences. Saturday morning arrived, and Sarah drove to the community center where Chen held her self-defense classes. About 20 women were gathered in the gymnasium, ranging in age from late teens to 60s. Chen introduced Sarah, mentioning her military background without going into specifics. The women looked at Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Sarah spoke for about 15 minutes, sharing general principles rather than specific techniques. She talked about awareness, about trusting your instincts when something felt wrong. She emphasized that avoiding dangerous situations was always better than having to fight your way out of them. She explained how predators often selected victims based on perceived vulnerability, and how projecting confidence could sometimes prevent an attack before it began. Then she shared the story of the diner, leaving out some details but conveying the essential facts. She explained how she had tried to de-escalate by remaining silent and non-confrontational, how she had only acted when physical force was used against her, and how her training had allowed her to neutralize the threat quickly and efficiently. The women listened intently, asking questions about how she stayed calm, how she knew what techniques to use, how she had developed her skills. Sarah answered honestly, explaining that her level of training had taken years and was far beyond what most people would need. But the basic principles, awareness and confidence, were things anyone could develop. After her talk, Chen led the class through practical exercises. Sarah watched as the women practiced basic strikes, escape techniques, and simple defensive maneuvers. She offered occasional suggestions, helping them improve their form and effectiveness. Several women approached her afterward, thanking her for sharing her story and inspiring them to take their safety seriously. One young woman, probably in her early 20s, lingered after the others had left. She told Sarah that she had been assaulted 2 years earlier and had been too afraid to fight back. She blamed herself for not resisting, for freezing instead of acting. Sarah listened carefully, then spoke gently but firmly. She explained that freezing was a natural biological response to extreme fear, that the woman had survived, and that survival was what mattered most. She told the young woman that taking this self-defense class was an act of courage, a choice to reclaim power over her own life. The past couldn't be changed, but the future could be different. The young woman's eyes filled with tears as Sarah spoke. She thanked Sarah and hurried away, but there was something different in her posture as she left. Her shoulders were a little straighter, her steps a little more confident. Sarah watched her go, hoping that the words had helped in some small way. Officer Chen walked Sarah to her car after the class ended. She thanked Sarah for coming and mentioned that several women had already asked if Sarah could speak to future classes. Chen explained that hearing from someone who had actually defended themselves successfully, who had faced real danger and prevailed, gave the students hope that they too could protect themselves if needed. Sarah said she would consider returning for future classes. It felt good to share her knowledge in a positive way, to help others feel more empowered and safe. This was different from her military service, but no less important. She was still protecting people, just in a different manner. On Monday morning, Sarah met with Commander Hayes at a corporate office downtown. The building was sleek and modern, 30 floors of glass and steel housing a tech company that had recently expanded into international markets. Hayes was waiting in the lobby, looking professional in a dark suit. Despite being retired from active duty for 2 years, the commander still carried herself with military precision. They rode the elevator to the 25th floor, where they met with the company's head of security, a former Marine named David Torres. Torres explained that the company was opening offices in 3 countries known for political instability, and wanted to ensure their employees would be safe. He needed someone to assess the security protocols and train the local security teams. Sarah listened carefully as Torres outlined the requirements. She asked detailed questions about the locations, the political climate, existing security measures, and potential threats. This was the kind of work she excelled at, combining her operational experience with practical security knowledge. Hayes had recommended Sarah specifically because of her ability to think like both a protector and a potential threat. The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end, Torres had hired Sarah for a 6-month contract that would require her to travel to all 3 locations and develop comprehensive security plans. The pay was excellent and the work was challenging. Sarah felt a familiar excitement building inside her. This was purpose. This was using her skills to keep people safe. As she and Hayes left the building, the commander suggested they grab lunch. They walked to a nearby cafe and sat at an outdoor table. Hayes ordered a salad while Sarah chose a sandwich. For a few minutes they ate in comfortable silence, enjoying the warm afternoon. Hayes finally spoke, asking Sarah how she was adjusting to civilian life. It was a question the commander asked regularly, genuine concern behind it. Hayes had mentored dozens of special operations personnel through the transition out of military service and knew how difficult it could be for some. Sarah admitted that it had been challenging at first. She missed the sense of mission, the clear objectives, the knowledge that her work directly saved lives, but she was finding new ways to contribute, new purposes to pursue. The consulting work was satisfying, and the incident at the diner had unexpectedly led her to start working with Officer Chen's self-defense classes. Hayes smiled at that. She said it sounded like Sarah was discovering that being a protector didn't require wearing a uniform or carrying military-grade weapons. Sometimes protection meant teaching a young woman how to strike an attacker's solar plexus. Sometimes it meant showing others that they had the strength to defend themselves. Sarah had never thought of it that way, but Hayes was right. She was still serving, still protecting, just on a different scale. Instead of conducting missions in war zones, she was empowering individuals to take control of their own safety. Both were valuable, both made a difference. Their conversation shifted to lighter topics. Hayes talked about her teenage son's soccer team and the vacation she was planning with her wife. Sarah mentioned her brother's wedding and how strange it had felt to be around so many people who lived completely normal lives, unaware of the dangers that existed in the world's dark corners. After lunch, they parted ways. Hayes reminded Sarah to call if she ever needed anything, whether professional advice or just someone to talk to who understood the unique challenges of their shared background. Sarah promised she would and meant it. Hayes had been more than a commanding officer. She had become a friend and mentor whose guidance Sarah valued deeply. That evening, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from Betty, the waitress from the diner. Betty had gotten Sarah's number from Officer Chen and hoped Sarah didn't mind the intrusion. Betty explained that a local television news program wanted to do a story about what had happened at the diner and had approached both her and Frank for interviews. Betty wanted Sarah's permission before agreeing to speak with the reporters. She understood that Sarah valued her privacy and didn't want publicity, but Betty also felt that the story could be important, could show other women that fighting back was possible, that training and preparation made a difference. Sarah thought about it carefully. Her instinct was to refuse, to keep the incident private, but she thought about the young women in Chen's self-defense class, about Betty's granddaughter in college, about all the people who might be inspired to learn self-defense after hearing the story. Maybe some good could come from the publicity after all. She told Betty to go ahead with the interview, but asked that her last name not be used and that they not show her face if they had any footage. Betty agreed and thanked Sarah for understanding. The news story would air later that week. Wednesday evening, Sarah watched the news segment from her couch. The report was titled, "Waitress Credits Navy SEAL Training for Stopping Attack." Betty and Frank appeared on camera, describing what they had witnessed that night. The reporter had also interviewed Officer Chen, who spoke professionally about the incident without revealing Sarah's full identity. The segment showed the exterior of the diner and briefly mentioned that 3 men had been charged with assault. It focused mainly on the message that self-defense training could make a critical difference in dangerous situations. At the end, the reporter mentioned local self-defense classes available in the community, including Officer Chen's program at the community center. Sarah's phone started buzzing with text messages. Her brother had seen the report and recognized the description of his sister, even without her name being used. He called immediately, worried and proud at the same time. Sarah assured him she was fine and explained what had really happened, filling in details the news report had left out. Her brother asked why she hadn't told him about it when it happened. Sarah explained that she hadn't wanted to worry anyone or make a big deal out of something she had handled easily. To her, it had been a minor incident, barely worth mentioning. Her brother reminded her that to normal people, defeating 3 attackers wasn't minor at all. It was extraordinary. Over the next few days, Sarah received several calls and emails. A women's magazine wanted to interview her about being a female Navy SEAL. A self-defense equipment company wanted her to endorse their products. 2 different gyms offered her positions as a self-defense instructor. A publisher inquired whether she would be interested in writing a book about her experiences. Sarah declined all of these offers politely but firmly. She appreciated the interest but had no desire to become a public figure or capitalize on her military service. She agreed to continue speaking at Officer Chen's classes occasionally, but that was the extent of her willingness to share her story publicly. The one offer she seriously considered came from a non-profit organization that provided self-defense training to women in underserved communities. They couldn't pay her, but offered the opportunity to make a real difference in the lives of women who were most vulnerable to violence. Sarah agreed to volunteer with them 1 weekend per month. 3 weeks after the diner incident, Sarah appeared in court to testify at the hearing for the 3 men. Michael Carson, the bearded man, appeared with his lawyer. He had cleaned himself up, wearing a suit and looking sober and remorseful. His nose was still slightly swollen but healing. The other 2 men also appeared, looking far less intimidating in the bright courtroom than they had in the dark diner. All 3 men pleaded guilty to assault charges. The judge listened to statements from Sarah, Betty, and Officer Chen before pronouncing sentence. Each man received probation, community service, mandatory alcohol counseling, and restraining orders preventing them from contacting Sarah or returning to the diner. Carson's lawyer presented the letter. Carson had written to Sarah as evidence of his client's remorse and commitment to change. The judge acknowledged this but made clear that remorse after the fact didn't excuse the behavior. He told the 3 men that they were fortunate Sarah had shown restraint in defending herself and that the outcome could have been far worse. As Sarah left the courthouse, Carson approached her carefully, maintaining a respectful distance. He thanked her for not pressing for harsher punishment and promised he was following through with his alcohol counseling. He asked if there was anything he could do to make amends. Sarah considered his question carefully. She told him the best thing he could do was become the kind of man his D. 6 months had passed since the incident at the diner. Sarah had settled into a comfortable rhythm in her civilian life. The consulting contract with the tech company had gone well, and she had successfully implemented security protocols in all 3 international offices. The company had already asked her to take on additional projects, and her reputation in the security consulting field was growing. Her volunteer work with the non-profit organization had become one of the most rewarding parts of her week. Every month, she spent a Saturday teaching self-defense basics to women in low-income neighborhoods. Many of these women had experienced violence firsthand or lived in fear of it daily. Sarah's training gave them not just techniques but confidence, a sense that they weren't powerless victims waiting for something bad to happen. Officer Chen's classes had also become a regular part of Sarah's schedule. She spoke to new groups of students every few months, sharing her story and answering questions about awareness, preparation, and the mindset needed to defend yourself effectively. Several women from the original class had continued their training and had become instructors themselves, creating a ripple effect that extended Sarah's impact far beyond what she could accomplish alone. The diner incident had faded from public memory, replaced by newer stories and concerns. But for Sarah, it had marked a turning point. She had spent 6 years as a Navy SEAL protecting people on a global scale, executing missions that saved lives but remained classified and unknown. Now she was protecting people on an individual level, empowering them to save themselves. Both roles were important. Both were service. On a cool autumn evening, Sarah returned to the diner for the first time since that night. She hadn't planned to stop there, but she was driving past and made an impulsive decision to pull into the parking lot. The neon sign still flickered in the same pattern, casting familiar red and blue shadows. Inside, Betty was wiping down tables just as she had been 6 months earlier. The older woman's face lit up when she saw Sarah walk through the door. Betty hurried over and hugged her warmly, asking how she had been and what she had been doing. Frank came out from the kitchen, equally pleased to see her again. Sarah slid into the same corner booth where she had sat that night. Betty brought her coffee without asking, remembering exactly how Sarah took it. They talked for a while, Betty updating Sarah on her granddaughter, who was doing well in college and had actually taken a self-defense class after hearing about what happened to her grandmother's customer that night. Frank brought out a slice of apple pie, this one fresh from the oven. He sat down across from Sarah for a moment, something he rarely did with customers. He told her that things had changed at the diner since that night. They had installed better lighting in the parking lot and a security camera system. Betty carried pepper spray now, and Frank kept a baseball bat behind the counter, though they hoped never to need it. But more than the physical security measures, something else had changed. Betty and Frank felt more aware, more prepared. They had realized how vulnerable they had been. Working late nights in an isolated location, they had taken control of their safety, rather than hoping nothing bad would happen. Sarah's actions that night had inspired them to be proactive. Several regular customers had heard about the incident through the news or local gossip. The diner had actually seen an increase in business, people curious to see the place where a Navy SEAL had taken down 3 attackers. Betty laughed about it, saying she never thought her little diner would become a local landmark for such an unusual reason. As Sarah finished her pie, a young woman entered the diner. She looked nervous, glancing around before approaching Sarah's table. Betty watched protectively but didn't interfere. The young woman introduced herself as Amanda, one of the students from Officer Chen's self-defense class. Amanda explained that she had been hoping to run into Sarah and had been coming to the diner occasionally, knowing it was where the incident had happened. She wanted to thank Sarah personally for speaking to their class. Amanda shared that just 2 weeks earlier, a man had followed her to her car after her shift at work. She had remembered what Sarah taught about awareness and projecting confidence. Instead of fumbling with her keys while pretending the man wasn't there, Amanda had turned to face him directly, stood tall, and asked loudly if she could help him. The man had been startled by her directness and confidence. He had muttered something and walked away quickly. Amanda was convinced that her demeanor, learned partly from Sarah's class, had prevented what could have been a dangerous situation. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest as she listened to Amanda's story. This was exactly why she had agreed to speak at the classes, why she volunteered with the nonprofit. One person empowered, one situation avoided, one life potentially saved. It mattered. They talked for a few more minutes before Amanda had to leave for her evening shift. As the young woman walked out, Sarah noticed something different about her compared to the nervous student who had attended that first class. Amanda walked with purpose now, her head up, aware of her surroundings but not fearful. She had internalized the lessons and made them part of who she was. Betty returned to Sarah's table with a coffee refill. She mentioned that several other women had stopped by the diner asking about Sarah, wanting to know more about her self-defense classes, or just hoping to meet the woman who had defended herself so effectively. Betty had given them information about Officer Chen's classes and the nonprofit organization, doing her part to spread the word about self-defense training. Frank came out from the kitchen again as the evening dinner rush began to arrive. He asked Sarah if she ever regretted leaving the military, if she missed the action and intensity of that life. It was a personal question, but asked with genuine curiosity and respect. Sarah thought about it for a moment before answering. She admitted that she did miss certain aspects of her SEAL career. The camaraderie, the sense of mission, the knowledge that her skills were being used to make a significant impact. But she didn't regret her decision to leave. She had given 6 years of her life to that service, had completed missions she was proud of, and had reached a point where it was time for a new chapter. This new chapter was different but no less meaningful. She was building something sustainable, something that would continue growing even after she was gone. Every woman she trained could train others. Every person she empowered could empower others. The impact multiplied in ways that covert military operations never could. Frank nodded thoughtfully at her answer. He mentioned that his own granddaughter, inspired by Sarah's story, had decided to join the Navy, She was in boot camp now and hoping to eventually try out for the SEAL program herself. The idea that a young woman could aspire to such a challenging and important role filled Frank with pride. Sarah smiled at that news. The Navy had only officially allowed women into the SEAL program a few years before Sarah had joined. She had been part of the first small group of women to complete the training successfully. It had been brutally difficult, facing not just the legendary physical challenges but also skepticism from some who doubted women could handle the demands. Sarah and the other women in her class had proven the doubters wrong through performance and determination. If Frank's granddaughter made it through the program, she would be following a path that Sarah had helped forge. That legacy felt significant in a way that individual missions never had. Sarah told Frank that if his granddaughter ever wanted advice or guidance about the program, he should feel free to pass along Sarah's contact information. As the evening wore on, Sarah prepared to leave. Betty refused to accept payment for the coffee and pie, insisting it was the least they could do. Sarah left a generous tip anyway, tucking the bills under her plate where Betty would find them later. Walking out to her car, Sarah paused in the parking lot and looked back at the diner. 6 months ago, she had stopped here during a long drive home, expecting nothing more than a quick coffee break. Instead, that night had become a catalyst for change, not just in her own life but in the lives of many others. She thought about the 3 men from that night. She had heard through Officer Chen that Michael Carson had completed his alcohol counseling and had maintained his sobriety. He was working to rebuild his relationship with his daughters and had become an advocate for alcohol awareness in his community. The other 2 men had been less successful in their rehabilitation, but Carson at least seemed to be genuinely trying to become a better person. Sarah drove home through the night, the highway stretching before her headlights. Her apartment would be quiet and peaceful when she arrived. Tomorrow she had a training session with the nonprofit in the morning, followed by a planning meeting for her next consulting project. Her schedule was full, her purpose clear. She thought about the young woman from the courthouse months ago, the one who had frozen during her own assault and blamed herself. Sarah hoped that woman was doing better now, learning to forgive herself and move forward. She thought about Amanda, who had faced a potential threat with confidence and turned a dangerous situation into a non-event through awareness and assertiveness. She thought about all the women in all the classes who were learning that they had power, that they could fight back, that